What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode. I'm 𝗪𝘆𝘀𝗀 from Project 10X, and today I want to discuss the 3 ways governments pay for their spending and what you can do about it to make sure that you don't get left behind financially. Now, I'll be going through the financial impacts of different forms of spending and how they apply to you. And I'm also going to give you examples of what the wealthy do to create that paper. So, governments really have 2 ways of paying for their expenditures. The most honest way is through current taxation. Now, obviously, that could be unpopular for the people who are paying the taxes, such as myself. However, nobody wants to pay taxes to the Australian government. And so when these politicians are running for re-elections, they don't want to have to tell the voters how much all these government programs cost. So if you look at the figure here from the Australian government budget paper, the programs include things like defence, education, health, economic response to COVID-19, etc. We also see that in the 2020-2021 financial year, 227.5 billion of government expenditure will go to social security and welfare, which is just over 1/3 of all government expenditure. So this includes things like the age pension expenditure, family tax benefits, childcare subsidies, JobSeeker, JobKeeper, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, the reason I bring this up is that there are certainly voters who benefit from the programs and couldn't care less about how much they cost because they're not the ones paying taxes. But then you have the group of voters who are paying taxes and who are not directly benefiting from a lot of those programs. And so they're more aware of what they cost. So politicians looking to get as many votes as possible try to find other ways to finance their spending that won't aggravate the taxpayer. In actual fact, looking at the ATO data, the Australian Taxation Office, they are planning on reducing personal tax rates in the next 3 years for people earning between $45,000 and $200,000, which is fantastic for the individual. But it also leaves me wondering 2 important points in particular. How the heck are governments going to pay for all the expenditures I showed you earlier with less tax dollars coming in? And I'll explain this next. And number 2, why are governments reducing personal income tax? I'd love to hear your answers to this question in the comments below, so comment away. Anyway, remember, the first way governments pay for its spending is taxation. Now, another way the government can do it, which is really just the first way but delayed, is by borrowing money. And I'm talking about borrowing it legitimately from a private lender who is willing to take the money and loan it to the Australian government by buying an AU Treasury bond from the government. So these lenders are generally institutional investors with big balance sheets. Things like pension funds, insurers, sovereign wealth funds, hedge funds, banks and other central banks. For example, if you have a super fund with a $200 billion balance on their balance sheet and it's sitting there collecting dust, this super fund would much rather earn a risk-free yield on that money. So instead of holding it there, they buy a treasury bond with a 1% yield. However, when governments borrow money, they're just delaying the taxation into the future, because whatever money the government borrows today must be repaid tomorrow. So where is the government going to get the money to repay the institutions that lent them money, aka the bondholders? Well, from the taxpayers of the future, of course, but in the meantime, the taxpayers of today have to pay the interest on the money that's been borrowed. So in other words, when governments pay for its spending programs by borrowing, the taxpayers are actually on the hook for an even greater cost, because not only do they pay back the principal, they also pay back the interest. It's just like if you go out and buy, let's say, a new TV. If you just buy it, it's cheaper than using a credit card and then paying your monthly minimum payments, because by the time you've paid the TV off, maybe you've paid 2 times the actual cost because of all the interest that you've paid over the years. When you pay for government programs with debt, by the time you repay the debt, the government programs were a lot more expensive than if you just paid for them with current taxation. But the benefit to politicians is that they can win voters by reducing personal income tax, all the while they're kicking the can down the road and making sure that future generations foot the bill. By and large, that is how a lot of our government spending has been paid for until recently. See, now the government must resort to a new method of finance because it is now impossible for the government to borrow money from private lenders because it can't afford to pay a high enough interest rate to private lenders to make this a viable transaction. And that is because of the enormity of the debt that we currently have. From this graph, you see that the 10-year Treasury yield has already been skyrocketing. The 10-year Treasury bond has gone from 0.9% in 6 months ago, that's the yellow plot, to 1.26% 1 month ago, that's the green plot, to 1.8% today, which is the blue plot. And remember, as yields rise, the cost of borrowing rises, which means government spending slows, such as we saw in 2018, or they come up with new ways to enable the spending of money. And one of those ways is money printing. I've been meaning to do that for so long, so now that I got it over and done with, I can put my Australian Reserve Bank of Australia money gun away. So, the Australian government has borrowed so much money to try and delay this day of reckoning for so long and kick the can down the road as we've gone deeper and deeper and deeper into debt, that right now the government is forecasting Australia's net debt position will be $703 billion for 2020-2021 financial year, and that debt will increase to $966 billion by the 2023-2024 financial year. That's almost a 40% rise in 3 years, and there is no way that the government can finance that. Repaying that debt is completely impossible, especially when looking at debt as a percentage of GDP. But at this point, the principle of the debt is just so enormous that even if the government was forced to pay a normal rate of interest, it could not make those payments. So what's happening now is that the government is financing its expenditures through inflation, and this is super important for those wanting to create wealth. The way that process works is the government issues debt, and then it's the Reserve Bank of Australia that buys the debt. But when the Reserve Bank buys the debt, it must expand the money supply, which is what we're doing here. See, when the government borrows from a private lender, it's taking money from one person and loaning it to another. It doesn't increase the money supply, and the person who is loaning the money to the government can't also spend that money because they've just loaned it to the government. And now the government gives it to someone else to spend. But when the Reserve Bank of Australia monetizes that debt and prints new money, then it's all new spending in the economy because the government hasn't taken money away from anybody, but it is giving new money to other people. So another way to think about it is that when the government taxes you to pay for its spending, it literally takes your money out of your paycheck, if it's an income tax, and then they give that money to somebody else in the form of government programs. And now somebody else spends that money that you earn. You can't spend it because the government took it and gave it to somebody else. So your standard of living is diminished because you have less money to spend. But when the government doesn't raise your taxes, if it just prints money and then gives it to the same individual to spend, your purchasing power, at least in dollar terms, hasn't been diminished. But now you have another guy or girl who is given all this cash that can now go out and spend it. And so what happens is that person competes with you to buy stuff and prices are a bit higher. And so the result of that type of taxation is that prices go up. Everything becomes more expensive. So instead of the government taking your money, the government takes the purchasing power of your money. So for example, take a look at commodity prices. And I covered this in last week's weekly update, but petrol is up 244%, copper is up 91%, corn is up 57%, sugar 33%, cotton 63%, and the list goes on. Meanwhile, the CPI is sitting at 1.9%. And right now, nobody seems to think this is a problem. People seem to think that we've stumbled onto the equivalent of a monetary fountain of youth. People like to call it modern monetary theory, which is we can have whatever we want as long as the government prints the money to pay for it. They think there's no limit, that the government is free as long as they print money. Why didn't we realize this in the past? Why have we been paying taxes all these years if all we had to do to have whatever we want is the equivalent of Control-P on the computer? After all, central bank money printing has been around for over 100 years, even if I only got my toy last week. So the reality is, this is a fantasy and it's going to end in disaster. See, there's a big difference between earning money and just having the government print it. See, when people are productive, when they have a job and they go to work, their labour is used to increase the supply of goods or services available to the public, right? If you have a job, you do work, and your work either aids in the production of a good, for example a farmer, that people want or need. Or if you're helping to provide a service, for example an electrician, that people want or need. In exchange for that help, you get money. And now you can use the money to help buy the goods and services that you yourself help to produce. And the more productive you are, the more you earn. And therefore, the greater share of what society produces, you are able to enjoy yourself. But when the government just prints money and gives it to you, when you have all these unemployed people just sitting at home, getting their JobKeeper, their job seeker, getting a paycheck from the government, they produce nothing. They have added no goods and services to the economy, yet they can consume goods and services in the same proportions as if someone had actually done work and actually been a productive member of society. So what does this do? Essentially, all this does is drive up the price, because if your work adds to the goods and services and now you're consuming the goods and services you help create, that's fine. But if now you start consuming goods and services, yet you didn't help create any of these goods and services, you just have more money chasing a diminished supply of goods and services, and prices are going to go up. Now, I'm not against JobKeeper or JobSeeker. I think the government didn't really have a choice, but it just goes to show the effects of expanding the money supply. So what does this all mean? It means that assets and equity prices such as housing, collectibles, art, Bitcoin, stocks are going to continue to go up. It means that the purchasing power of our dollars in our bank accounts is going to decrease. So what's the solution? The solution is to look at what the wealthy have been doing since the dawn of fiat money, and that is buying assets to at least maintain the purchasing power of our dollar. See, they don't hold large amounts of cash relative to their overall portfolio size. Meanwhile, we've been programmed to think that saving cash in the bank account will lead us to us being wealthy. We ought to be turning that cash in the bank account into assets with capital growth. So let's take a look at a few examples. Everyone knows Bill Gates, right? He's a business magnate, he's the co-founder of Microsoft, he's one of the richest people in the world, and he is now the largest private owner of farmland in the US. I wonder why. Perhaps because land is an appreciating asset which is limited in supply, right? There's only so much land on Earth. Next, we have a look at Warren Buffett, right? He's one of the greatest investors to have ever walked this planet and also one of the richest men in the world. And he's well known for picking stocks and holding them forever. Why? Because stocks grow at an average rate of about 7% per year since record keeping began, while our savings accounts give us a measly 0.05%, unless you're in Europe, in which case they have a negative interest rate, which means they charge you to hold your money. Finally, let's take a look at Peter Thiel. For those that don't know Peter Thiel, he's a billionaire entrepreneur and venture capitalist who famously founded PayPal and more recently Palantir. Peter came out on a podcast and said, "My candidate for the investment that is so big and so stupid that professional money managers are embarrassed to do it because it suggests that they're not doing enough work is to just buy Bitcoin." Now, there are so many examples that attribute wealth to holding assets, and yet we hold cash in our bank account. Seems a little silly, doesn't it? To me, it does anyway. So, now some people are going to come out and say, well, you know, cash is king. To those people I say, take a look at the products and services around you and try to remember how much less they cost 12 months ago. If you can't remember, take a look at the rise in commodity prices or the rise in house prices or the rise in Bitcoin. If you don't want to do that, then make a list of the price of things that you typically buy. Your groceries, your petrol, your jewelry. If you're thinking of buying a house in a particular area, check out the median house price. Now revisit those prices every 3 months and ask yourself, are prices going up? If the answer is yes, it means the purchasing power of your dollar is being diminished. There's also people that are going to say, I can't afford a house, or I'm not an electrician, I don't buy copper. To those people, I say, take a look at the assets that you can buy. The most lucrative asset and best performing asset, by and large, over the last 12 years is Bitcoin. And you don't have to buy one Bitcoin. You can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. Then those same people might say, well, Bitcoin is too volatile. Well, if you zoom out and look at the big picture, then you'll see that Bitcoin is not as volatile as you might think. And when you start measuring things in terms of Bitcoin instead of the AUD, everything gets cheaper. Tertiary education, groceries get cheaper, petrol gets cheaper, houses, cars, you name it, it all gets cheaper relative to Bitcoin. Ultimately, what this all means is that we're continuing to create a wealth gap between people with assets and people without assets. And that is a huge problem for people that don't currently hold assets, such as most millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. Ultimately, if you don't hold assets and you're born after 1981, you're stuffed. Now, if you're interested in buying digital assets such as Bitcoin, there are plenty of resources to learn how to do that online, and I'll leave a link to those below. If you would like a more tailored approach, where we work with you hand in hand, what we do is offer a 90-minute workshop so we can better understand your current situation. Then we get you set up with an exchange to buy the digital assets. We also get you set up with a personal wallet to store your crypto. And we show you how you can earn 6 to 10% interest, which might I add is about 120 times more interest than my bank is currently offering me in my high interest saver. If this sounds like something that you are after, then I'll leave a link below for you to get in touch. If you have any questions, we are always online and happy to answer any questions that you may have. So head on over to our page, click the chat icon and ask away. Anyway, that's all we have time for today, folks. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like and subscribe button and remember to turn on notifications so you can stay up to date on all the latest. Peace.